The sound of mourning in the ancient Near East was not quiet. It was physical, chaotic, and loud. We assume he happens to walk past this village, sees a weeping woman, feels a sudden wave of pity, and decides to intervene. Luke records that the bearers stood still. They freeze. The wailing of the hired mourners falters into a stunned silence. The pallbearers stop walking because they cannot comprehend what this rabbi has just done. He has willfully infected himself with the impurity of the grave. But the hidden mechanism of this miracle is about to be revealed. When Jesus touches the untouchable, the contamination of death does not flow upward into him. The power of life flows downward into the wood. He does not become unclean. The dead boy becomes clean. Jesus does not stand at a safe, holy distance to perform his work. He willingly takes on the contamination of death to stop the procession. He touched the wood, but one detail still does not fit. Why did he do it? Jesus healed many people, but he did not stop every funeral in Galilee. What was it about this specific widow that provoked a holy rabbi to break cultural protocol, risk his reputation, and march through the exhausting heat of the day for a stranger? The answer is not found in the action. It is found in the internal mechanism that drove it. To understand what caused Jesus to break the boundaries of the ancient world, we have to look at a single, highly specific Greek word Luke uses to describe his heart. We treat the miracle as a random encounter of compassion on a busy itinerary. The problem is, that version of the story completely ignores the geography of Israel. Why did Jesus touch the untouchable wood? What internal force drove him to march 30 miles uphill, shatter cultural boundaries, and willingly take on the ritual impurity of a corpse for a woman he had never met? The English translation of Luke's Gospel offers a very simple explanation. It says that when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her. The problem is that our modern English phrase is entirely too weak. When we hear the word compassion, we usually imagine a polite, distant sympathy. We think of a sad smile, a quiet sigh, or the feeling of writing a condolence card. It is a clean, manageable emotion that allows us to remain safely disconnected from the tragedy. But the Greek word Luke chooses to describe the internal state of Jesus is not clean, and it is not polite. The word is splanchnizoomai. To understand this term, we have to look at its root. It comes from the noun splanchna, which literally translates to the internal organs, the intestines, or the bowels. In the ancient Middle East, they did not believe that the deepest human emotions were housed in the brain or even in the heart. They believed the most profound, intense feelings resided in the gut. Splanchnizoomai does not mean to feel sorry for someone from a safe distance. Nain was not on the way to anywhere important. It was a small, obscure, walled village tucked away on the steep, rocky slopes of Mount Moreh. It describes a sudden physical twisting of the stomach. It is a gut-wrenching, visceral agony of empathy. It is the feeling of having the breath knocked out of you when you witness an unbearable tragedy. Luke, who was a physician, uses this specific anatomical language to show us exactly what happened when the eyes of Jesus met the eyes of the grieving widow. Jesus did not merely observe her pain. The sight of her devastation physically moved him in his core. The grief of this anonymous woman registered in the gut of God. This is the hidden mechanism behind the entire journey. This is why he left Capernaum in the dark. This is why he touched the contaminated bier. He was driven by an agony of empathy that refused to let death have the final word. Standing beside the frozen pallbearers, Jesus looks down at the exposed corpse. He speaks directly to the dead flesh. "Young man, I say to you, arise." The text does not say Jesus prayed for hours. There is no elaborate ritual. He simply speaks into the silence of the gate. Instantly, the blood begins to pump. The lungs pull in the dry Galilean air. The dead man sits up on the wooden board and begins to speak. Then, Luke records one of the most beautiful. There was no major trade route passing through it. No rabbi on a preaching tour would casually walk through Nain by accident. Understated sentences in all of Scripture. And Jesus gave him to his mother. The mourning is shattered. The social execution of the widow is canceled. Her future, her security, and her family name are handed back to her in a single act of divine authority. But the story does not end with a tearful reunion. Luke tells us that absolute fear seized the entire crowd. The wailing of the mourners turns into shouts of terror and awe. But listen closely to the exact words they choose to shout. They do not just praise God for a generic miracle. They cry out, "A great prophet has arisen among us." Why did they choose that specific title? Why a prophet? The answer reveals a deeper, ancient secret buried right in the soil beneath their feet. When the boy sits up and speaks, the crowd realizes that this is not just a random display of power. They are witnessing the deliberate recreation of history. To understand what the crowd suddenly recognized, we have to look at the mountain they are standing on. When the dead man sits up and speaks, absolute fear grips the village of Nain. The wailing of the mourners abruptly stops. You only went to Nain if Nain was your final destination. To make matters more complicated, Luke's gospel tells us exactly where Jesus was just before this event, replaced by shouts of terror and awe. But the exact words the crowd chooses to shout are incredibly specific. They do not merely thank God for a generic display of power. They cry out, "A great prophet has arisen among us." Why did they instinctively use that specific title? In the first century Jewish mind, resurrection was not a normal category for a traveling rabbi. Dead people did not simply wake up. Throughout their entire recorded history, raising the dead was an event tied almost exclusively to the greatest prophets of the Old Testament, specifically Elijah and Elisha. The crowd recognizes what is happening because they know their local geography. Step back and look at the map of the region. Nain sits on the northwestern slope of Mount Moreh. If you were to walk just a few miles around to the southwestern slope of the exact same mountain, you would find another small village. Its name is Shunem. Centuries earlier, recorded in the 4th chapter of 2 Kings, the prophet Elisha regularly traveled through Shunem. A prominent Shunammite woman built a small room on her roof to host him. Miraculously, she was given a son in her old age. But years later, while out in the harvest fields, the boy collapsed from a sudden pain in his head and died in his mother's arms. He was in Capernaum, a bustling fishing town on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. Capernaum sits nearly 700 feet below sea level. Elisha returned to Shunem, climbed into the upper room where the dead boy lay, and pleaded with God. After a tense, agonizing process of prayer, the boy sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes. Elisha summoned the grieving mother and handed her son back to her. Now, nearly 900 years later, on the exact same mountain, another mother is weeping over her dead son. The crowd at the gate of Nain knows the ancient stories of their own soil. When Jesus touches the wooden bier and commands the boy to rise, they instantly make the connection. They realize this is not a random miracle. It is a deliberate, orchestrated recreation of history. Jesus has intentionally chosen the slopes of Mount Moreh to prove exactly who he is. He is mapping his ministry directly over the greatest prophets of Israel, but he is also escalating the pattern. When Elisha raised the boy in Shunem, it was a struggle. The prophet had to pace the floor, pray desperately, and physically stretch himself over the corpse twice before life returned. Elisha was merely an instrument, pleading with God to act. Jesus does not plead. He does not pace. He does not perform a ritual. He simply looks at the dead flesh and speaks a single sentence of command. Jesus is not asking God for a miracle. Nain sits roughly 700 feet above sea level. The distance between them is nearly 30 miles. Funerals in the ancient Middle East happened quickly. He is speaking with the authority of God himself. He is declaring that he is the ultimate prophet, the promised deliverer who holds absolute power over the grave. The historical and theological architecture of this moment is stunning. The geography, the timing, and the ancient echoes all align perfectly to reveal the identity of Christ. But if we stop there, we miss the heart of the narrative. The history of Mount Moreh matters, but the journey up that hill is where the story becomes deeply personal. Because this is not just an ancient account of a widow in a dusty Galilean village. It is a mirror for how God pursues us today. The widow of Nain did not know the theological history of the mountain when she was walking toward the grave. She did not know. She was participating in a prophetic echo of Elisha. She only knew what was physically in front of her: a wooden bier, a dusty road, and the absolute finality of the stone gate. When you are in the middle of a devastating crisis, you are not thinking about grand biblical patterns or profound theological architecture. You are simply trying to survive the walk. There are seasons in your own life where you find yourself in the exact same posture as this anonymous woman. You are walking behind something that has died. It might be a marriage. Because of the climate, a body was usually buried on the exact same day the person died, often late in the afternoon before the sunset, that is fractured beyond what seems repairable. It might be a sudden medical diagnosis that has fundamentally altered your future. It could be a profound failure, a silent battle with depression, or a long, agonizing season of waiting that has finally bled into despair. You are marching toward what feels like a permanent ending, surrounded by the loud braying, heavy evidence of your own loss. In those moments, the deepest pain is often the silent assumption that God is absent. You look at your circumstances and draw the most logical conclusion: heaven has missed the appointment. Jesus is busy in Capernaum. He is blessing someone else. He is healing the centurion's servant, while your own situation continues its slow, unyielding march toward the graveyard. You assume that because you cannot see the rescue is not happening. But this is where the geography of Nain confronts your despair. What the widow could not see through her tears was that while she was walking toward the gate, Jesus had already been marching for 10 hours to meet her. He did not wait for her to arrive at the tomb before he started moving. He left before the sun came up. He pushed through the darkest, most exhausting parts of the valley while she was completely unaware of his approach. For Jesus to arrive at the gates of Nain at the precise moment this procession was leaving the city, he could not have been wandering aimlessly. This changes how you must view your own waiting. The silence of God in your current season does not mean he has abandoned you. The delay is not a denial. Often, the silence simply means he is on the road. The pressure you feel right now is not evidence of his indifference. It is the tension of a divine collision being perfectly timed. What are you carrying into your delay? What have you mistaken for finality? If you are in the middle of a crushing circumstance, you do not need to manufacture a false, shallow optimism. The text gives us a concrete way to respond. Recognize what is happening. Name your grief honestly. Just as the widow wept openly. Do not deny the reality of the wooden bier or pretend the pain does not exist. But place your pain within the larger truth of this Galilean road. Choose to trust the unseen approach of Christ. You may not see him cresting the hill yet, but you can trust the character of the God who walks 30 miles through the dirt for a broken heart. You may be walking toward what feels like an absolute end, entirely unaware that Jesus has been moving through the darkness to intercept your specific crisis. We spend all of our emotional energy focusing on the terrifying finality of the gate, but we forget who is standing on the other side. He would have had to leave Capernaum before dawn. He would have had to push himself, his disciples, and a large crowd through a relentless, the very place that was meant to be an exit of despair is about to become the place of resurrection. When we step back and look at the complete architecture of this narrative, the true weight of the miracle finally becomes visible. The grueling, 30-mile uphill journey from Capernaum, the devastating socio-economic reality of the grieving widow, the gut-wrenching, visceral compassion that drove a holy rabbi to absorb the ritual contamination of a corpse, the ancient prophetic echo of Elisha ringing across the slopes of Mount Moreh. None of these details are a coincidence. They converge on this single, dusty road to rewrite our understanding of how God responds to human suffering. If we compress this event into its most vital truths, we are left with 3 profound realities. First, we learn that the compassion of Christ is never passive. It is not a distant sympathy offered from the comfort of heaven. It is a calculated, exhausting, relentless physical pursuit. Second, we see that Jesus refuses to remain at a safe, holy distance from our pain. He willingly steps into the chaotic, untouchable, unclean ruins of our lives to bring restoration. And third, we discover that the authority of Jesus over death is absolute. He does not plead for a miracle. He commands it. This brings us back to the stone archway at the edge of the city. Shrill notes of lament played on wooden flutes pierced the air. Hired mourners wailed, tearing their garments and throwing dust into the wind. Exhausting. Uphill march, climbing 1,400 feet in elevation through the punishing heat of the day. The timing is too perfect. The geography is too brutal. At the beginning of this story, that gate was a terrifying symbol. In the ancient world, it marked the definitive boundary between the safety of the living and the wilderness of the dead. For the anonymous widow, crossing that threshold meant absolute finality. It was the point of no return, the exact moment her only son would be surrendered to the darkness of the tomb, and her own life would be surrendered to a quiet, devastating poverty. The stones of that gate represented the death of her hope. But because Jesus chose to walk through the suffocating heat of the Jezreel Valley, the meaning of that architecture has been permanently transformed. The boundary of finality became the theater of resurrection. The very threshold that was supposed to mark the end of her family line became the exact location where her future was physically handed back to her. The gate did not change its location, but its purpose was entirely rewritten by the man who stood in the middle of the road and refused to move. This is the profound promise for your own life. When you reach the boundary of your own strength, when you stand at the threshold of what feels like an irreversible ending, you are not standing there alone. The God of Scripture does not wait for us. Which brings us to the central question. Why did Jesus make an agonizing 30-mile uphill journey to an isolated village? To find him in the middle of our grief. He travels the impossible distance, pushing through the darkness and the silence of our waiting, to meet us at the exact hour of our greatest vulnerability. This was never a story about a passing moment of pity. It is a story about the deliberate, relentless pursuit of divine compassion. The exhaustion of the journey was simply the cost of grace. He will not let you walk out into the graveyard alone. When you are carrying your heaviest grief, look up. He is already standing at the gate. If this journey through Scripture helped you see the intentionality of God more clearly, please consider subscribing to the channel and sharing this study with someone who might be in a season of waiting. Leave a comment below with what stood out to you most. And until next time, keep reading closely. Just to intercept a funeral at the exact second it reached the city boundary, the familiar interpretation is not entirely wrong. It is simply incomplete. This is not ultimately a story about a spontaneous act of pity. It is a story about the calculated, relentless, physical pursuit of divine compassion. Over the next few sections, we are going to look closely at the history, the hidden Greek words, and an ancient prophetic echo buried deep in the soil of this mountain. But to understand the true weight of this miracle, we must first measure the cost of getting there. The collision at the stone gate was orchestrated, but it required a grueling march. To see the depth of this rescue mission, we have to trace the geography of pursuit. The road heading south from Capernaum begins along the water before turning sharply inland and upward. It is not an easy road. When Luke records this event, he notes a specific detail of timing. Depending on the manuscript translation, the text says Jesus went to Nain soon afterward, and at the center of this noise, beneath the heavy, uneven breathing of the men carrying a wooden bier, or the next day, he had just healed a Roman centurion's servant in Capernaum. The crowds were celebrating. The ministry was thriving in the city. There was no strategic reason to leave immediately. Yet, before the sun crested the horizon, Jesus began to walk. Imagine the physical reality of this journey. The Sea of Galilee sits deep in the Jordan Rift Valley, nearly 700 feet below sea level. The air there is thick and heavy. To reach Nain, Jesus and his followers had to travel south through the valley, turn west into the vast expanse of the Jezreel Valley, and finally begin a grueling ascent. Nain sits on the rocky northwestern slope of Mount Moreh, roughly 700 feet above sea level. This was a 30-mile journey, on foot, through the dust and the suffocating heat of the ancient Middle East. The Jezreel Valley was a wide, flat expanse of agricultural land baked by the midday sun. Crossing it during the hottest hours of the day would drain the strength of even an experienced traveler. Their feet would ache against the uneven dirt and loose stones. The disciples must have been exhausted. Their garments would have been stained with sweat, their leather waterskins nearly empty. They were likely confused, wondering why their rabbi was marching them relentlessly toward a tiny, insignificant farming village. Lay the body of a young man bound in linen. Walking closely behind him is his mother. She is a widow, and this is her only son, with no major synagogue and no political importance. A healthy person walking at a strong, uninterrupted pace would need 10 to 12 hours to cover that distance, especially considering the final, punishing climb of 1,400 net feet in elevation, to arrive at the gates of Nain by late afternoon, the traditional time. For a Jewish burial, Jesus could not have lingered. He could not have stopped for long meals or casual teaching along the way. He had to drive the pace. Jesus knew exactly what he was doing. Every step was calculated. He was racing the sun. He was racing the stone gate. He knew that in that obscure village, a boy's heart had stopped beating. He knew the women were already preparing the body with spices and wrapping it in linen. He knew the exact hour the flute players would arrive, and the wooden bier would be lifted. Jesus subjected himself to the physical agony of a 30-mile uphill march because he refused to let that mother walk out of the city gates alone. The exhaustion of the journey completely rewrites how we understand the miracle. The physical toll proves the intentionality. God did not simply notice her pain in passing. He planned a deliberate rescue mission to intercept it. But that raises a new question. Death was a common, brutal reality in the ancient world. People were buried every single day across Judea and Galilee. Ahead of them looms the stone archway of the city gate. In the ancient world, the gate was the definitive boundary between protection and wilderness. What was it about this specific funeral that commanded the immediate, urgent attention of Jesus? Why did he leave the success of Capernaum for her? To understand why this was an absolute emergency, we have to look away from the dusty road and step inside the walls of Nain. We have to look at the woman walking behind the wooden bier. Because, for this widow, the march to the graveyard was not merely about mourning her son. It was about her own survival. The text gives her no name. In the ancient world, a woman was typically identified by the men around her, first as a daughter, then as a wife, and finally as a mother. This woman has lost all three titles. Watch her walk behind the wooden bier. Her garments are torn in mourning. The dust of the street clings to her feet. The wailing of the hired mourners surrounds her. But her own grief is likely a heavy, suffocating silence. To understand the absolute devastation of this moment, we have to look at the economic structure of first-century Galilee. In this patriarchal society, a woman's survival depended entirely on the male covering in her life. Property rights, inheritance, and legal standing were passed exclusively through the men. For this funeral procession in the village of Nain, the gate marks an even darker boundary. It is the dividing line between the living and the dead. When a woman married, her protection shifted from her father to her husband. If her husband died, she became a widow, instantly dropping into the most vulnerable class of people in the ancient Near East. The biblical law commanded Israel to care for the widow, but the harsh reality was often a life of exploitation, marginalization, and severe poverty. But until today, this woman had a lifeline. Luke includes a short, devastating detail that changes the entire economic picture. The dead man was the only son of his mother. While her husband's death had brought severe grief, her son's existence meant she still had a place in the community. As the only male heir, He would inherit whatever land or trade his father left behind. He would work. He would protect her legal rights. He would provide the food for her table in her old age. He was her pension, her security, and her hope. Now, his body is wrapped in linen, moving steadily toward the graveyard. This economic reality changes how we view the weeping crowd. Luke tells us that a considerable crowd from the town was with her. The village of Nain is mourning the tragic death of a young man, but they are also witnessing a social execution. When they pass through the stone gate to place his body in a tomb, they are effectively burying her future. Once they pass through that stone arch and step outside the city walls, the boy will be placed in a tomb without an heir. The family name will be completely extinguished. Whatever property she lived on will eventually pass to distant male relatives. Her likely future is reduced to gleaning leftover grain from harvested fields, relying on charity, or begging in the streets. She is not just weeping for the loss of a child. She is walking toward her own destitution. The stone gate of Nain represents the point of no return. Once the bier crosses that threshold and moves into the burial caves outside the walls, her fate is sealed. The procession moves with the heavy, unyielding momentum of inevitability. There is nothing anyone can do. The town has completely given up. Death has taken everything, and all that remains is to finish the brutal ritual. They reach the archway. The men carrying the wood step into the narrow shadow of the gate. But then, the procession is forced to a sudden halt. The exit is blocked. Just as the mourners attempt to leave the city, the exhausted, dust-covered crowd from Capernaum arrives, cresting the hill at the exact same moment. The timing is impossibly precise. Two massive groups, a procession of death and a procession of life, are about to collide at the narrowest point in the city. The town knows what happens when two crowds meet in a gateway. The smaller group must yield. The finality of the grave will take hold. The story will be over. When most of us read this account, in the 7th chapter of Luke, but the man standing at the front of the Capernaum crowd does not step aside. Instead, he steps directly into the path of the dead. The collision at the stone gate is a masterpiece of divine timing. The crowd from Capernaum, covered in the dust of a 30-mile uphill march, stands face to face with the wailing procession of Nain. The narrow archway cannot accommodate both groups. Custom dictates that the smaller group, or the one entering the city, should yield to the mourners. Jesus does not move aside. He looks directly at the grieving mother. The text in Luke 7 tells us that when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said, "Do not weep." On the surface, it is a startling thing to say to a widow at her only son's funeral. In almost any other context, telling a grieving mother to stop crying is terribly insensitive. But Jesus is not offering empty pastoral comfort. He is not offering a religious cliché about the boy being in a better place. He is issuing a gentle command based on what he is about to do. He is telling her that the mourning is over. Then, he does the unthinkable. He steps toward the procession. He reaches out his hand, and he touches the open bier. We imagine it as a beautiful, spontaneous coincidence. We picture Jesus casually strolling through the Galilean countryside with his disciples. To understand the absolute shock of this moment, we have to understand how the ancient Jewish world viewed the physical reality of death. In the 1st century, they did not bury their dead in closed wooden boxes. A bier was simply a flat, open wooden plank or a woven wicker frame. The corpse was wrapped in linen, but the body was completely exposed. Jesus is standing inches from the dead boy's face. According to the laws of Numbers 19, a human corpse was the highest source of ritual impurity. To touch a dead body, or even the structure carrying it, rendered a person ceremonially unclean for 7 days. They were barred from the temple. They were isolated from the worshiping community until a rigorous, multi-day purification ritual was completed. For a holy man, purity was fiercely protected. A respected rabbi would shrink back against the stone walls of the gate to ensure not even the hem of his garment brushed against the funeral bier. He would maintain a safe, holy distance from the contamination of the grave. Jesus does not stand at a safe distance. He does not shout a healing command from the back of the crowd. He deliberately steps into the zone of contamination. He places his naked hand directly onto the wood. The reaction is immediate.